And I would like to take you to a totally different place. It's a German prison camp during the Second World War. And this man, Archie Cochrane, is a prisoner of war. He's an epidemiologist, a doctor. He's Scottish. He speaks fluent German. And he has a problem. And his problem is that he's in charge of the prisoners. He's a prisoner himself. And many of the men under his care are extremely sick. They're suffering from a condition that Archie doesn't understand. He can see the symptoms. There's a horrible swelling up of fluids under the skin. He knows it's debilitating, it's painful, it may be fatal, but he doesn't know what the cause is. Is it an infection? Is it a nutritional problem? He doesn't know. And to add to the complication, he is trying to solve this problem in a very hostile environment. So it's a war. There is no reason to expect a great deal of kindness from the prison camp guards, and in fact, the relationship between the prisoners and the guards has pretty much broken down. So the guards will shoot across the camp for fun, just to see if they hit anything. On one occasion, one of the guards took a grenade and threw it into the prisoner's lavatory. He said he heard suspicious laughter. And Archie Cochrane, as the camp doctor, he's one of the first men who has to go into the lavatory and to try to sort out the mess. Oh, and there's one other thing, which is Cochrane himself is suffering from the same illness. So what does he do? Archie's a resourceful person, and he realizes he has what he needs to start exploring this problem. He has already managed to smuggle into the camp tablets of vitamin C. And he then manages to buy on the black market a substance called Marmite. Now, those of you who are not British may not know about Marmite, I can see some of you do. Just to explain, Marmite is a breakfast spread. It looks like crude oil. It tastes, tastes zesty, and it's a source of vitamin B12. It's based on yeast, and it's a source of vitamin B12. So Cochrane has the vitamin C, the vitamin B12. He divides his patients up into two groups that are as equal as he can make them, and he gives vitamin C to one group and vitamin B12, the Marmite, to the other group. And he meticulously records his results in a little notebook. And a few days later, it becomes clear that whatever is the cause of this illness, the cure is Marmite. The cure is vitamin B12. So then Archie has to go and make his case. So he goes to the camp guards. And you have to imagine this man with his long, ragged beard, he's not shaved, a strong Scottish accent, but ranting in fluent German, because he lived in Berlin for many years, about how Germany is the culture that gave Goethe to the world and gave Schiller to the world, and how is it possible that it could sink to this barbarism. And he waves his results around, and then he gives up. He goes back to the ward. He gives Marmite, the B12, to all the patients who had been receiving the vitamin C, and then he returns to his room, and he breaks down and cries, because he's sure that he's failed. He isn't going to make a difference. But a young German doctor picks up Archie Cochrane's little notebook and the meticulous graphs in the notebook and says, "Gentlemen, this evidence is incontrovertible. If we do not supply vitamin B12 to these prisoners, it's a war crime." And the next day, vitamin B12 began to show up at the camp, and the prisoners recovered. The reason I wanted to tell you about Archie Cochrane was not because I think he's an amazing man, although he is an amazing man. It's not even because I think that we should be doing many, many more randomized trials of policy, trials in education, trials of prison reform, trials of unemployment reform, although I think that is also a very good idea. What I really wanted to talk to you about was something that Archie Cochrane campaigned against all his life. It was a condition that he fought his whole life, and he called it the God complex. And I can describe the symptoms of the God complex very easily. The symptoms of the God complex are a conviction that no matter how complicated the world is, you know the answer. No matter how challenging your problem, you don't need evidence, you don't need a second opinion, you know the answer, you just need to go for it with enough determination. Now, Cochrane was a doctor, so he saw the God complex around him all the time. Obviously, as an economist, I don't see the God complex so often in my fellow economists, but maybe just occasionally. And I thought that's what I wanted to talk about today, the God complex, and particularly how important it is in a world where everything is economics these days. So part of the problem is that the economy is so incredibly complex. I mean, the human body is complex. Doctors understand they don't really understand the human body, but you think the human body is complex, you wait until you see the human economy, 7 billion people. In fact, let me tell you about a lovely little project that was done that it tells us not only how complex the economy is, but how complex even a small part of the economy is. So it's called the Toaster Project. Let's have a slide. Yeah, there's a picture of a toaster. This toaster costs £4, about €5. It was bought in London 3 years ago by a student called Thomas Thwaites. And Thomas Thwaites had an idea. What he wanted to do was to build from scratch his own toaster. He's going to buy this toaster, take it apart, figure out how it works, and then just one design student, armed only with a penknife, clad only in a pair of boxer shorts. I know it's hard to imagine, but now you've started imagining it, it's hard to stop. He's going to make a toaster. That's a wonderful project, really instructive. So the first thing you do, of course, with this project is let's take apart the toaster and see what's inside it. So it turns out that even this €5 toaster, a £4 toaster, contains over 400 components and subcomponents. Many, many different materials. There's copper, there's iron, there's zinc, nickel, mica. Mica is a material a bit like slate. You wrap the heating elements around. There's plastic. The plastic is very important. I mean, without the plastic, you don't have this beautiful looking toaster. Also, you get electrocuted. So the plastic is important in many ways. So Thwaites was trying to build this toaster. So Britain is a post-industrial society. We don't have many of these materials around anymore. So he said, okay, I'm going to start by getting iron. I'm going to find an iron mine. There are no iron mines. So he phones an iron mine, a museum that used to be an iron mine, says, I'm a design student, I'm trying to make a toaster. They said, yeah, sure, come. He arrived, and then they said to him, oh, we thought you said you were trying to make a poster, not a toaster. It's an easy mistake to make, but they gave him some iron. That's very nice. Here's some iron. He then had to turn the iron into, the iron ore into iron. So this is an attempt at turning the iron ore into iron. There's a leaf blower punched through the back of this. He's trying to blow oxygen over. This was a total failure. This was more successful. This is an iron in a microwave. Turns out that there is a recently developed process for smelting iron in a microwave. This, by the way, I should say, is the second microwave. The first microwave. But this is a tremendously complicated process. He went through compromise after compromise after compromise. I mean, where does the oil come from? Where does oil come from? Yeah? By the way, this whole talk is about how you should be able to make mistakes and not be afraid. Where does oil come from? Yeah? BP. Yeah? They have loads of it. And we know plastic comes from oil. Oil comes from BP. So you want plastic, you have to phone BP, ask them if they'll fly you to an oil rig. They said no. So he's making compromise after compromise after compromise. And what is the result? Okay, remember, what did we start with? A £5 toaster, a £4 toaster, €5 toaster, 400 components, makes excellent toast. Where did we get to? Well, Thomas Thwaites spent 9 months, over €1,200, and in the end, I don't know how to best describe what he produced. You know, when I was little, my mother would make me birthday cakes in a special shape. You get like a birthday cake in the shape of a dinosaur, or a birthday cake in the shape of a castle. Imagine I had asked my mother to make a birthday cake in the shape of a toaster. And imagine also that she had been very drunk. What you would get, give us some slides, please. What you would get. So here's the question, does it make toast? I asked Thomas about this. He said, well, actually, if I plug it into a car battery, the bread gets warm, but I don't know what will happen if I plug it into the mains. And in the end, he did plug the thing into the mains, and 2 seconds later, the toaster was toast. So this gives us a real idea of just how complex the objects in the world around us are. But in fact, it's more complicated even than that. I mean, I've just given you one particular object. Let me draw you, I can draw you a map of the world economy, okay? Here's a map of the world economy. This is drawn by a physicist at MIT called Cesar Hidalgo. It's not a geographical map, it's a map based on the similarity of products. So here you can see heavy machinery grouped with other heavy machinery, garments grouped with garments, fabrics grouped with fabrics, chemicals grouped with chemicals. It's very important work. Cesar is a network physicist. He specializes in taking raw data and pulling out very complex patterns. Don't bother looking at it, you won't understand it. It's far too complicated to understand. But the important point about this, brilliant work, is there are 5,000 product categories here. And 5,000 product categories is nothing. Yeah? If you were to count 5,000 products, one per second, you would have, if you'd started at the beginning of this morning's session, you'd already be finished. 1.5 hours would take you. If you were to try to count the products in a big box store such as Walmart, it would take you over a day. There are 100,000 products in a typical Walmart. And if you were to try to count all the different products and services available in a major city economy, so in New York or London, I'm not talking about how many individual products, I'm talking about how many types of product, distinct types of product and service. Imagine you had a barcode. You need a different barcode for every one. How many in New York? Well, the economist Eric Beinhocker from McKinsey reckons there are about, let's see where this particular object is broken. There we go. There are about 10 billion distinct products and services. If you were to count them all, it would take you 417 years, one a second. That is the complexity. A simple toaster defies human imagining, and yet we have an economy with 10 billion distinct products and services. This is the complexity that we face. This is why Archie Cochrane's message of humility, you don't know the answer first time around, you need to test your ideas, you need to experiment, you can't solve these problems first time, is so important. I mean, what I'd like to say is, it's not so much that everything is economics, it's more that these days, the economy is everything. The economy is all around us. It's hugely complex. We don't fully understand it. And if you try to solve problems first time, the God complex vision, you are going to come unstuck very, very quickly. So how do we solve problems in a world this complicated? It's so easy to see how our leaders get confused and politics doesn't seem to be up to the task. How do we solve problems in a world this complicated? Well, I think the thing to really recognize is that there is a way to solve problems, but that way involves completely abandoning this God complex and embracing the idea that you're going to make mistakes. Trial and error is tremendously important. In fact, any complex system that works, I would suggest to you, has developed through a process of trial and error. My clicker's not working, so let me have the next slide if I can. Yeah? And again? All right, I'm going to try the clicker. Process of trial and error, very important. And another. Thank you. Isn't he nice? This is a creature that developed through a process of trial and error. Oh, behave. I didn't mean that. What I mean is it's a human being. It's a human being. It's a wonderful, wonderful human being, incredibly sophisticated, incredibly complex, incredibly well adapted through an evolutionary process. And we know about Darwinian evolution, Charles Darwin's dangerous idea. What is it? Complexity emerges through variation and selection. Variation and selection, by which we mean trial and error. Trial and error. And it's not just in a biological context that you see this. You see this in an industrial context as well. So, tell you about a Dutch company, Unilever. Unilever have a problem. They want to figure out how to make detergent more efficiently, soap powder for your washing machine. So, how you make detergent, you have a big liquid vat of detergent, and you pump it through a tiny nozzle, and it forms a fine spray. Then the spray dries and forms into powder and falls to the ground. And you scoop up the powder, you put it in a box, you sell it at a supermarket for lots of money. But the design of the nozzle is a very important thing. Now, how do you design this nozzle? Well, if you believe the God complex idea, you get the smartest mathematician, the smartest fluid dynamics expert, the smartest physicist to design you this nozzle. And Unilever tried this, and it was a complete failure. So then somebody said, well, okay, abandon the God complex. Maybe we don't really understand this problem. Maybe we should just approach it through trial and error. So then you take a nozzle, and you create a small variant on the nozzle, 10 small variants. You test out the 10 small variants. You see which one works best. You take 10 variants of the most successful variant. You try those 10 out. You do it again. You do it again. You do it again. And eventually you get this thing that looks like a chess piece. It works fantastically well. We have no idea why it works. Purely emerged through trial and error. We have no idea why it works. Now, what does this have to do with economics? Well, the economy itself is a wonderful machine for trial and error. And when it works well, it's a wonderful machine for the safe kind of trial and error. So you think of all the entrepreneurs with their new ideas. You think of all the new technologies emerging from the universities. Even, I have to say, bureaucrats in some big companies occasionally launch new products or have new ways of doing things. All of these new ideas, that's a huge amount of variation, a huge amount of trial. And then the error? Well, we see plenty of error. The error comes through bankruptcies, through mergers, through corporate failure. 10% of American businesses disappear every year. That's a huge failure rate. You can't understand how the economy works unless you think about this failure rate, 10%. I mean, this is much higher than the failure rate of Americans. I mean, which presumably means American businesses are evolving at a faster rate than Americans. And American businesses will eventually, make Americans their pets. Eventually. Maybe it's already happened, we don't know. And I have the statistics for America, but the same is true of Europe. Failure rates in European economies, I'm not talking about recession, I'm not talking about crisis, I'm talking about ordinary business of economic development is a business of constant variation, constant trial, and then selection, error, corporate failure, businesses going under. You cannot understand the way the economy works unless you view it through this lens. So the economy, if it's working well, if the market is working as it should work, it doesn't always work like this. We have too big to fail these days. But if the market is working as it should work, it's a great antidote to the God complex. Because it gives people lots of hope, try new things, maybe you'll be the next Sergey Brin, maybe you'll be the next Mark Zuckerberg, try something new. And of course you'll probably fail, and then we cut you off and throw you out, and somebody else will try something, or maybe you'll try something different. It's a tremendous evolutionary process, and that's how economic growth comes. Now, the trouble is that this is all a challenge for me and for you. It's a challenge to all of us. Because we're far more comfortable with the God complex. We're far more comfortable thinking that we know the answer. We are taught that we can know the answer if we only try hard enough. You think back to you're all very talented young people here. Think back to your school education. you're doing spelling, you're doing physics, you're doing maths. In these problems, there is an answer. There is a correct answer, right answer, wrong answer. If you can't find the right answer, it's because you're stupid or because you didn't work hard enough. And for sure, there is a God in the corner of the classroom, and she or he knows the answer. Now, I understand why this is how education works, but it's not necessarily a very good model for how the real world works, because when you go out into the real world, and already you start to see it at university, you realize there are no right answers, or at least the right answers aren't obvious, and the teacher doesn't know the answer, and you're going to have to explore it by yourself. So it's a real challenge to us because of the way we're educated. It's a challenge to us because of our psychology. We hate small losses. One of the most important ideas in behavioral economics is loss aversion. Even if the loss is very, very small, we hate it, we fight against it. So we're not really willing to take these small risks. And in fact, what happens is if we seem to be losing out, if we seem to be taking a small risk, we put more and more energy, more and more money, more and more time, and we turn a small failure into a huge failure. We're very, very good at this. It's not just Eurozone politicians, it's all of us. We're very good at turning a small failure into a big one because we don't know when to quit. So this is a huge challenge. Archie Cochrane understood this challenge. That's why all his life he campaigned against this God complex. I mean, he would always say to people, you don't know that you are right. He would always be testing the ideas, challenging the ideas. There's one wonderful story about Archie Cochrane where he managed to convince, and it was very, very difficult, he managed to convince the doctors in the local area to run a trial of post-cardiac care. You've had a heart attack. Where do you recover? In the hospital, specialist ward, or at home? Where's the best place? The doctors all ran the hospitals. They all said, well, of course you have to recover in hospital. Of course this is the best place. And Archie Cochrane said, okay, fine. Let's experiment. Let's try because you might be wrong. And that they challenged him. They said, this is unethical behavior. You are risking people's lives. But he managed to get this through. And he gathered together all his colleagues a few months later. He said, well, we've begun the trial. We have some preliminary results. We have early results. They're not yet statistically significant. But the preliminary results are, I'm wrong, you're right. The patient should be recovering in the hospital. And of course, all the other doctors banged on the table. We always said you're unethical, Archie. We always said you shouldn't be allowed to do this kind of thing. We need to stop the trial at once. You're killing people. So Archie lets them all talk and talk. Then he says, okay, that's very interesting because when I gave you the results, I swapped the columns over in the table of results. And it seems that your hospitals are killing people and they're safer at home. Shall we stop the trial now? Or do you want to keep going until we have more information? Imagine now the tumbleweed blowing across the table. But he would do that, he would play with people like that because he knew you had to force people to acknowledge the possibility that they were wrong, the possibility that the path they were on was not the right path. This morning I woke up and I heard that Steve Jobs had died in the night. And I was really struck by one of his most famous speeches. It's not the speech where he launched the iPhone or the iPod or the iPad or any of these things. It's a speech he gave to a group of students like you at an occasion a little bit like this, 6 years ago. And he told some of the stories of his life. And one of the things he talked about really feeds into Archie Cochrane and the God complex. It's being forced to try something different. Now imagine you're all at these great universities, your careers are going very well, you're getting good results in the exams. Imagine just stopping and dropping out because your parents cannot afford to send you to the university you're at. They can't afford to support you. That's the situation Steve Jobs found himself in. After 6 months, he dropped out of Reed College. He didn't drop out of all the classes, he just dropped out of the formal courses. And then suddenly he was free to experiment. He was free to go to any class he liked. And he ended up hanging around the calligraphy class, where he learned about fonts, and he learned about kerning and spacing and design. And it didn't seem to have any purpose. He had no mission in life, he had no God complex, he was just experimenting. And it just seemed to be an interesting thing to do. And a few years later, when he had the opportunity to set up Apple with Steve Wozniak, it all came back to him, and he realized that these experiments, which seemed to be just a piece of fun, seemed to be just something to do because he didn't know where he was going in his life. Instead, these experiments have produced something very, very important. And that's why computers are the way they are today, because Steve Jobs was forced to quit what seemed like the right path, and he was forced to just try something new. And it happened again to him. When he was kicked out of Apple, he was 30 years old. He was forced out, and he said, you know, he was distraught, he was mourning, he was ashamed, he wanted to run away from Silicon Valley. And then he said, but I then realized this was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was constrained and constrained and constrained by success. I couldn't experiment. I didn't have options. I couldn't be creative. I just had to keep going on the same path. And when I was kicked out, suddenly I could do anything. You know, the success was a prison. Failure set you free. But even Steve Jobs had to be forced to do it. He didn't do it deliberately. He didn't want to do it. He had to twice be forced to experiment. And that's, I think, a profound challenge to all of us. Because the world gets better when people try things that are new, when people test their ideas, when people are willing to fail. And failure is very, very, very common. But as a whole, we benefit from the experiments that work out. But even someone like Steve Jobs had to be forced into it. And that's why, for me, the message of Archie Cochrane always saying, always run the trial, always test your ideas, never be sure that you're right, is so important. Ever since I began studying this whole field, I've been really struck by a statement that was made about 15 years ago by a Japanese mathematician. Let me take you back just after the Second World War. A young Japanese mathematician called Yutaka Taniyama, with his friend Goro Shimura, developed an amazing idea in mathematics called the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture. I'm not a mathematician, it's too complex even to explain, but huge edifices were built on this conjecture. The mathematics got bigger and bigger and bigger, all building on this idea of how hyperbolic objects fitted together. The idea was so powerful, if you could prove it, you could prove Fermat's last theorem. Fermat's last theorem is like a little footnote of the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture. But they couldn't prove it. It seemed to be true. Everybody acted as though it was true, but we didn't know that it was true. And in 1952, before he was even 30 years old, Yutaka Taniyama killed himself. Several decades later, Fermat's last theorem was proved because the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture was proved by a British mathematician. And the journalists were swarming over this problem, and it was all very interesting. And they found Yutaka Taniyama's old friend, Goro Shimura, now in his 70s. They interviewed him, and they said, what was it like to work with Taniyama? What was he like as a person? And Shimura said, well, he was not a very careful person as a mathematician. He made a lot of mistakes. But he made mistakes in a good direction. I tried to copy him, but I realized it's very difficult to make good mistakes. Thank you very much.